He was the king of a vast empire, but the world watched in disbelief as his rule descended into chaos. George III wasn't just losing colonies, he was losing control over his own mind. But what was really going on inside the palace walls? Strange incidents began to pile up. Servants whispered about his violent outbursts. Advisors feared the king was no longer the man they once knew. What if this wasn't just about the collapse of an empire? What if something darker, more sinister, had taken hold of the king himself? Could the pressure of war really explain the madness that followed, or was there a shadow of conspiracy at play, something no one dared to confront? As his reign fell apart, George's mind unraveled in ways that terrified even those closest to him. Hidden documents, secret conversations, and disturbing patterns began to emerge. This isn't just the story of a king who lost his power, this is a story about what happens when a king loses his grip on reality. By the end of this video, the shocking truth about George III's final days will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about this fallen monarch. George was born on June 4, 1738, in Norfolk House, St. James's Square, London. He was the grandson of King George II and the eldest son of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. Since George was born 2 months early and was not expected to survive, he was baptized the same day by Thomas Secker, who was both the rector of St. James's Church and the Bishop of Oxford. A month later, he had a public baptism at Norfolk House, again officiated by Secker. His godparents included King Frederick I of Sweden, his uncle Frederick III, Duke of Saxe-Gotha, and his great-aunt Sophia Dorothea, Queen in Prussia. Growing up, George was a healthy but reserved and shy child. The family moved to Leicester Square, where he and his younger brother Edward were educated by private tutors. By the age of 8, George could read and write in English and German and could discuss current political events. He was also the first British monarch to study science in a structured way. His education covered a wide range of subjects, including chemistry, physics, astronomy, mathematics, French, Latin, history, music, geography, commerce, agriculture, and constitutional law. He also learned social skills like dancing, fencing, and riding. His religious education was Anglican. At 10, George participated in a family performance of Joseph Addison's play Cato, where he delivered a new prologue that hinted at his pride in being English. King George II was not fond of Prince Frederick and showed little interest in his grandchildren. However, when Frederick unexpectedly died from a lung injury in 1751 at the age of 44, George became the heir to the throne and inherited his father's title of Duke of Edinburgh. Shortly after, the king took a greater interest in George and named him Prince of Wales. As George approached his 18th birthday in the spring of 1756, the king offered him a grand residence at St. James's Palace. However, George, guided by his mother and her advisor, Lord Bute, turned down the offer. His mother, now the Dowager Princess of Wales, wanted him to stay home so she could instill her strict moral values in him. In 1759, George III found himself infatuated with Lady Sarah Lennox, the sister of Charles Lennox, the 3rd Duke of Richmond. However, his advisor, Lord Bute, discouraged the match, leading George to set aside his thoughts of marrying her. He wrote, "I am born for the happiness or misery of a great nation," indicating that he felt his duty to the country was more important than his personal desires. Despite this, George and his mother resisted the king's efforts to arrange a marriage between him and Princess Sophie Caroline of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Sophie Caroline eventually married Frederick, Margrave of Bayreuth. The following year, when George was 22, he became king after the sudden death of his grandfather, George II, on October 25, 1760, at the age of 76. With this new responsibility, the search for a suitable wife intensified. After considering several Protestant German princesses, George's mother sent Colonel David Graham to propose marriage to Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz on behalf of her son. Charlotte accepted the offer, and preparations were made for her arrival in London. On September 8, 1761, Charlotte arrived in the afternoon, and the wedding ceremony took place that same evening in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. Just 2 weeks later, on September 22, George and Charlotte were crowned at Westminster Abbey. George was known for his fidelity. He never took a mistress, which was in contrast to his grandfather and his sons. George and Charlotte enjoyed a happy marriage, lasting until his mental health began to decline. Together, the king and queen had 15 children, 9 sons and 6 daughters. In 1762, George purchased Buckingham House, which is now known as Buckingham Palace, to serve as a family retreat. Other residences included Kew Palace and Windsor Castle, while St. James's Palace remained for official functions. George did not travel much during his life and spent most of his time in southern England. In the 1790s, he and his family started taking holidays in Weymouth, Dorset, helping to make it one of the first popular seaside resorts in England. In his accession speech to Parliament, George III declared, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." He included this phrase in his speech, which was written by Lord Hardwicke, to show that he wanted to separate himself from his German ancestors. Many believed these ancestors cared more for Hanover, their homeland, than for Britain itself. During George III's long reign, Britain was a constitutional monarchy, meaning that the country was largely governed by his ministers and key figures in Parliament. At first, his accession was met with enthusiasm from politicians across all parties. However, the early years of his reign were marked by political unrest, primarily due to disagreements stemming from the 7 Years' War. As time went on, many began to see George as favoring Tory ministers, which led the Whigs to label him an autocrat. When he became king, the income from crown lands was relatively low, with most of the revenue coming from taxes and excise duties. To support his household and civil government expenses, George agreed to surrender the crown estate to parliamentary control in exchange for a civil list annuity. There were claims that he misused this income to reward supporters with bribes and gifts, but many historians argue that these claims were based on false information spread by unhappy opponents. Throughout his reign, debts totaling over £3 million were paid off by Parliament, and the civil list annuity was adjusted several times. George III was also known for his generosity. He supported the Royal Academy of Arts with significant grants from his own funds and may have donated more than half of his personal income to charitable causes. Among his art collection, 2 notable pieces were Johannes Vermeer's Lady at the Virginals and several works by Canaletto. However, George III is especially remembered for being an avid book collector. His King's Library was open to scholars and served as the foundation for a new national library, ensuring that knowledge and literature were accessible to many. In May 1762, Thomas Pelham Hollis, the first Duke of Newcastle, led the Whig government but was replaced by Lord Bute, a Scottish Tory. Bute faced strong opposition, with critics spreading rumours that he was having an affair with the king's mother. They also took advantage of anti-Scottish feelings among the English. John Wilkes, a member of Parliament, published the North Briton, a newspaper that harshly criticised Bute and his government. Wilkes was eventually arrested for seditious libel but fled to France to avoid punishment. He was expelled from the House of Commons and was found guilty in absentia of blasphemy and libel. In 1763, after concluding the Peace of Paris, which ended the 7 Years' War, Lord Bute resigned. This opened the way for the Whigs, now led by George Grenville, to regain power. Britain gained significant territory as a result of the treaty, including West Florida, but returned profitable slave sugar islands in the West Indies, such as Guadeloupe and Martinique, back to France. Canada was ceded to Britain, along with land stretching between the Allegheny Mountains and the Mississippi River, except for New Orleans, which was given to Spain. Later that year, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 established limits on westward expansion for the American colonies and created an Indian Reserve. The proclamation aimed to redirect colonial expansion toward Nova Scotia in the north and Florida in the south, protecting British fur trade with Native Americans. While the proclamation line did not trouble most settled farmers, it was unpopular among a vocal minority, leading to growing tensions between the colonists and the British government. The British government believed that since American colonists were not heavily taxed, they should contribute to the defense of the colonies against potential Native American uprisings and French incursions. The central concern for colonists was not how much tax they had to pay, but whether Parliament had the right to impose taxes without American representation. The colonists believed they had the same rights as all Englishmen, including the principle of no taxation without representation. In 1765, Grenville introduced the Stamp Act, which required a stamp duty on every document in the British colonies. Since newspapers were printed on stamped paper, those most affected were also the most effective at rallying opposition to the tax. At the same time, George III became frustrated with Grenville's efforts to limit the king's powers. He unsuccessfully tried to persuade William Pitt the Elder to take on the role of Prime Minister. Following a brief illness, George chose Lord Rockingham to form a new ministry and dismissed Grenville. Lord Rockingham, supported by Pitt and the king, repealed the unpopular Stamp Act. However, Rockingham's government was weak, and he was replaced by Pitt in 1766, who George elevated to Earl of Chatham. The repeal of the Stamp Act was so well received in America that statues of both Lord Chatham and George III were erected in New York City. In 1767, Lord Chatham fell ill, and Augustus Fitzroy, the third Duke of Grafton, took over the government, although he didn't formally become Prime Minister until 1768. That year, John Wilkes returned to England and ran for a seat in Parliament, winning the election in the Middlesex constituency. However, he was expelled from Parliament again. Wilkes was re-elected and expelled 2 more times, until the House of Commons declared his candidacy invalid, naming the runner-up as the winner. Grafton's government fell apart in 1770, allowing the Tories, led by Lord North, to return to power. George III was a very religious man and often spent long hours in prayer. However, his brothers did not share his strong beliefs, which troubled him greatly. In 1770, his brother Prince Henry, the Duke of Cumberland and Strathern, was caught having an affair. The following year, Henry married Anne Horton, a young widow. George found Anne unsuitable as a royal bride because she came from a lower social class and, according to German law, any children they had would not be part of the Hanoverian succession. To prevent further issues, George pushed for a new law that would require royal family members to get the king's consent before marrying. This law was not popular in Parliament, even among George's own ministers, but it was passed as the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. Shortly after this law was enacted, another brother, Prince William Henry, the Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh, revealed that he had secretly married Maria, Countess Waldegrave, who was the illegitimate daughter of Sir Edward Walpole. This news confirmed George's belief that he was right to introduce the law, as Maria was related to some of his political rivals. Because of this, neither of the women was ever welcomed at court. During this time, Lord North's government was focused on dealing with growing discontent in America. To calm American feelings, most customs duties were removed, except for the tea tax. George believed this tea tax was important to maintain the right to impose taxes. In 1773, American colonists boarded tea ships in Boston Harbor and threw the tea overboard in an event known as the Boston Tea Party. In Britain, public opinion began to turn against the colonists, and even Lord Chatham agreed with Lord North that the destruction of the tea was a criminal act. With strong support from Parliament, Lord North introduced measures that the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These included shutting down the port of Boston and changing the charter of Massachusetts so that the upper house of its legislature was appointed by the Crown rather than elected by the lower house. Up to this point, George had hoped for a political solution and often went along with his cabinet's decisions, even when he had doubts about their effectiveness. Evidence from the years between 1763 and 1775 suggests that George III should not be blamed for the American Revolution. Although Americans and some British historians viewed him as a tyrant, during these years, he acted more like a constitutional monarch, supporting the actions of his ministers. The American War of Independence marked the end of the political and civil changes that began in America. In the 1760s, the British Parliament passed several laws that upset the 13 colonies in America. The colonists were particularly unhappy with new taxes imposed by Parliament, especially since they had no representatives in that body. The colonies had previously enjoyed a significant amount of independence in managing their own affairs, so they viewed these laws as an attack on their rights as English citizens. In April 1775, armed conflict broke out between British soldiers and colonial militias during the battles of Lexington and Concord. The Second Continental Congress sent requests to the king for help in dealing with Parliament, but George III and Parliament ignored these pleas. Instead, George labeled the American leaders as traitors, leading to a year of fighting. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, famously referred to George III as the royal brood of Great Britain. In July 1776, the colonies declared their independence from Britain, outlining 27 grievances against George III and the British government. Among the accusations were that he had abandoned governance in the colonies, robbed their seas, devastated their coasts, burned their towns, and caused suffering for the people. In a show of defiance, a statue of George was pulled down in New York. Although the British captured New York City in 1776, they lost Boston, and their strategy of invading from Canada to cut off New England failed with the surrender of British Lieutenant General John Burgoyne after the battles of Saratoga. Prime Minister Lord North was not the best choice for leading the war, but George III provided Parliament with a purpose to continue fighting, and North managed to keep his cabinet intact. However, some of his cabinet members, such as the Earl of Sandwich and Lord George Germain, lacked the necessary leadership skills for their roles. Many blame George III for stubbornly insisting that Britain continue the war against the American rebels, even when some of his ministers disagreed. Historian George Otto Trevelyan noted that the king was determined never to acknowledge the independence of the Americans, and sought to punish them by prolonging the conflict. He wanted to keep the rebels in a state of anxiety and poverty until they would eventually feel regret and remorse for their actions. But just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse for George III, a shocking twist changed everything. Hidden away from the public eye, a discovery was made that left his advisors in a state of panic. What had they found? And why did they go to such lengths to keep it from ever being revealed? This secret wasn't just about the king's declining health, it was far more dangerous. By the time you hear what was uncovered, you'll realize that George III's collapse wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was something far more catastrophic, with consequences that would ripple through history. However, some historians defend George, arguing that no king would willingly give up such a vast territory, and his actions were less brutal compared to other monarchs in Europe at the time. After the Battle of Saratoga, both Parliament and the British public supported the war effort, with recruitment levels remaining high and political opposition being relatively small. With setbacks in America, Lord North suggested that power be given to Lord Chatham, whom he believed could lead better. However, George refused this request and instead offered Chatham a subordinate position, which Chatham rejected. He passed away later that same year. North aligned himself with the king's friends in Parliament and believed George had the right to wield power. In early 1778, France, Britain's main rival, formed an alliance with the United States. The French fleet managed to bypass the British naval blockade in the Mediterranean and arrived in America, further complicating the conflict, which now impacted regions beyond America, including Europe and India. King Charles III of Spain was cautious due to his own colonies but chose to support France in a limited way in 1779. Different factions within the Dutch Republic sided with both the Americans and the British, while the British had support from Loyalists and German troops. Some of George's ministers, including Lord Gower and Lord Weymouth, resigned from the government. Although Lord North requested to resign as well, he stayed in office at George III's insistence. During the summer of 1779, a combined French-Spanish naval fleet threatened to invade England, planning to transport 31,000 French troops across the English Channel. George III described this situation as the most serious crisis the nation ever knew. In August, 66 warships entered the English Channel, but disease, hunger, and bad weather forced the French-Spanish fleet to retreat, ending the threat of invasion. Later in 1779, George III proposed sending more British ships and soldiers to the West Indies. He boldly stated, "We must risk something, otherwise we will only vegetate in this war. I wish to either fight through it with determination or face a ruinous defeat." In January 1780, 7,000 British troops led by General Sir John Vaughan were sent to the West Indies. However, opposition to the costly war was growing, culminating in the Gordon riots in London in June 1780. Despite some victories for the British, such as the defeats of Continental forces at the Battle of Camden and the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Loyalists still held hope for a win. In late 1781, news of Lord Cornwallis's surrender at the Siege of Yorktown reached London, leading to a decline in support for Lord North, who resigned the following year. George drafted a notice of abdication but never delivered it. Eventually, he accepted the defeat in America and allowed peace negotiations to begin. Britain formally recognized the United States' independence in the Treaties of Paris, signed in 1782 and 1783. By early 1783, George III privately acknowledged, "America is lost." He realized that the northern colonies had grown into successful rivals to Britain in trade and fishing. Up to 70,000 Loyalists fled to Canada, the Caribbean, or back to England. In 1785, John Adams was appointed the American minister to London. By that time, George had come to accept the new relationship between Britain and its former colonies. He told Adams, "I was the last to consent to the separation, but since it has happened, I have always said that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power." After Lord North's government fell in 1782, Lord Rockingham, a member of the Whig Party, became Prime Minister for a second time but died just a few months later. Following his death, King George III appointed Lord Shelburne as his successor. However, Charles James Fox, a leading figure in Parliament, refused to work under Shelburne and insisted that William Cavendish Bentinck, the third Duke of Portland, take the position. In 1783, the House of Commons forced Shelburne out of office, leading to the formation of the Fox-North coalition government, with Portland as Prime Minister and Fox and Lord North as Foreign and Home Secretaries, respectively. George III strongly disliked Fox, both for his political views and his character. The king considered Fox to be untrustworthy and worried that he would negatively influence the Prince of Wales. George felt frustrated that he had to appoint ministers he did not support. Nevertheless, the Portland administration quickly gained a strong majority in the House of Commons and was not easily removed from power. The situation became more complicated when the government introduced the India Bill. This bill aimed to reform the administration of India by transferring authority from the East India Company to parliamentary commissioners. Although George supported more control over the company, he disapproved of the proposed commissioners, as they were all political allies of Fox. After the House of Commons passed the India Bill, George instructed Lord Temple to inform the House of Lords that he considered any peer who voted for the bill to be his enemy. The House of Lords rejected the bill, and shortly after, George dismissed the Portland ministry. He appointed William Pitt the Younger as Prime Minister, with Temple serving as his Secretary of State. On December 17, 1783, Parliament passed a motion condemning the king's influence in parliamentary matters as a high crime, leading to Temple's resignation. His departure weakened the government, and 3 months later, the administration lost its majority, prompting Parliament to dissolve. The subsequent election gave Pitt a strong mandate. Pitt's appointment was a significant win for George III. It demonstrated that the king could choose prime ministers based on his interpretation of public sentiment, rather than solely following the majority in the House of Commons. Throughout Pitt's time in office, George supported many of his political goals and created a large number of new peers in the House of Lords to strengthen Pitt's position. During and after Pitt's ministry, George enjoyed considerable popularity in Britain. The public admired him for his religious devotion and loyalty to his wife. He was a caring father, though he faced heartbreak with the deaths of 2 of his sons during their infancy, in 1782 and 1783. Despite his affectionate nature, he maintained strict rules for his children. They were expected to follow a rigorous schedule of lessons starting early in the morning and to lead lives grounded in religious observance and virtue. When his children deviated from these values, particularly his sons as they grew older, George felt disappointment and distress. By this time, King George III's health was worsening. He suffered from a mental illness marked by severe mania. For many years, people believed his condition was psychological. However, in 1966, a study by Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter suggested that the king's illness was actually physical, caused by a liver disorder called porphyria. This theory faced some opposition but gained acceptance among scholars over time. A study of George's hair published in 2005 showed high levels of arsenic, which can lead to metabolic blood disorders and could have triggered porphyria. The source of the arsenic remains unknown, but it might have come from medications or cosmetics. The idea that George suffered from porphyria became popularized through dramatic portrayals, such as Alan Bennett's play, The Madness of George III, and Nicholas Heitner's film adaptation. However, from 2010 onward, this perspective has faced challenges, and some recent research argues against the porphyria theory, suggesting instead that George may have had a psychiatric condition, likely bipolar disorder. George may have experienced a brief episode of illness in 1765, but a more severe episode began in the summer of 1788. After the parliamentary session ended, he travelled to Cheltenham Spa to rest and in August visited the Bishop of Worcester and Viscount Mount Edgecombe, accompanied by the Queen and their daughters. This trip took him further from London than he had been in a long time, but unfortunately, his condition worsened. By November of that year, he became seriously unwell, speaking for hours without stopping, which sometimes caused him to foam at the mouth and made his voice hoarse. He often repeated himself and would write sentences that were over 400 words long. His language became more intricate and imaginative, which could be symptoms of bipolar disorder. George's doctors struggled to understand his illness, leading to many unfounded stories about his behavior, including a rumor that he shook hands with a tree, thinking it was the King of Prussia. Treatments for mental illness at the time were rudimentary. His physicians, including Francis Willis, used methods such as restraining him until he calmed down or applying harsh poultices to eliminate what they believed were evil humors. When Parliament reconvened, Fox and Pitt argued over how to manage a regency during the King's illness. Both agreed that it would be logical for the Prince of Wales to take on the regent's role. However, Fox proposed that the prince had the absolute right to act with full powers on behalf of his ill father. Pitt, concerned that empowering the prince could lead to his own removal from office, argued that it should be up to Parliament to choose a regent and wanted to limit the regent's authority. In February 1789, the Regency Bill, which would allow the Prince of Wales to act as regent, was introduced and passed in the House of Commons. However, before the House of Lords could pass the bill, George unexpectedly recovered. After George III's recovery from his earlier health crises, both he and Prime Minister Pitt experienced a surge in popularity, particularly in contrast to their political adversaries, such as Charles Fox and the Prince of Wales. This shift in public sentiment was partly due to George's compassionate treatment of two individuals with mental illnesses who had attempted to harm him. In 1786, Margaret Nicholson tried to stab the king, but he responded with understanding, showing kindness rather than anger. Similarly, when John Frith attacked him in 1790, George's humane approach further endeared him to the public. These incidents helped enhance his image as a monarch who could empathize with the struggles of his subjects. The atmosphere in Britain was tense during this period, especially following the French Revolution of 1789, which alarmed many British landowners and aristocrats. They feared that revolutionary ideas might spread to Britain, challenging the established social order. The situation escalated when France declared war on Great Britain in 1793. In light of this crisis, George allowed Pitt to implement significant measures, raising taxes, expanding the military, and suspending the right of habeas corpus. These actions were controversial, leading to Pitt prosecuting British radicals for treason in 1794, further inflaming tensions in society. In October 1795, while on his way to open Parliament, George's carriage was attacked by a mob demanding an end to the war with France and lower bread prices. The king's safety was jeopardized, and this incident prompted Parliament to enact the Treason and Seditious Meetings Acts in November 1795, which aimed to suppress dissent and prevent further uprisings. During this tumultuous period, the First Coalition, comprising Austria, Prussia, and Spain, was initially formed to oppose revolutionary France. However, this alliance began to crumble in 1795, as Prussia and Spain signed separate peace treaties with France. The Second Coalition, which included Austria, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, also faced defeat by 1800, leaving Great Britain as the only major power still engaged in hostilities against Napoleon Bonaparte, the first consul of the French Republic. The cessation of hostilities for a time allowed Pitt to address the situation in Ireland, which had experienced an uprising and an attempted French invasion in 1798. To solidify British control and quell Irish discontent, the British and Irish parliaments passed the Act of Union in 1800. This act came into effect on January 1, 1801, effectively merging the two entities into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. It was during this period that George also relinquished the title King of France, a relic of past monarchs that had been maintained since the reign of Edward III. Despite suggestions that he adopt the title Emperor of the British Isles, George opted not to take on any new titles. In the context of his policies toward Ireland, Pitt aimed to address the legal restrictions placed on Roman Catholics. He sought to emancipate them from various disabilities. However, George III vehemently opposed this, arguing that doing so would violate his coronation oath to uphold Protestantism. The conflict over Catholic emancipation led to heightened tensions within the government, as Pitt threatened to resign in response to the king's unwavering stance. Around the same time, George suffered another relapse of his previous mental illness, which he attributed to the stress surrounding the Catholic question. On March 14, 1801, Pitt was replaced by Henry Addington, the Speaker of the House of Commons, who was less willing to advocate for Catholic rights. Addington's administration focused on fiscal responsibility by instituting annual accounts, abolishing income tax, and beginning a disarmament program. In October 1801, he successfully negotiated peace with France, signing the Treaty of Amiens. Despite the peace, George remained skeptical, regarding it as merely an experiment. His concerns were validated when hostilities resumed in 1803. Public confidence in Addington as a wartime leader faltered, with many expressing a preference for Pitt. An imminent invasion by Napoleon prompted a significant volunteer movement, with citizens rallying to defend their homeland. In late October 1803, George reviewed a formidable gathering of 27,000 volunteers in Hyde Park, an event that drew an astonishing 500,000 spectators. As George III's condition worsened, the palace walls hid more than just whispers of madness. Unusual and alarming events began taking place inside his chambers. Strange rituals, questionable treatments, and the involvement of mysterious figures. Were they trying to save the king, or was something far more sinister at play? What really happened behind closed doors? Could it be that George wasn't just fighting his own mind, but also the very people meant to protect him? By the end, you'll be left wondering, was the king a victim of his own illness, or was there a plot that brought him to his knees? Newspapers noted the fervent enthusiasm of the crowds, with one courtier even commenting on George's readiness to lead troops into battle if necessary. In a letter to Bishop Hurd, George expressed his concern over a possible French landing and his willingness to command his forces in defense of England. As the situation continued to unfold, George's health issues returned in 1804. Following his recovery, Addington resigned, and Pitt returned to power. However, George remained opposed to including Fox in Pitt's ministry. This refusal led to tensions within the government, and Lord Grenville, feeling that Fox was treated unjustly, declined to join Pitt's administration. Instead, Pitt aimed to form a third coalition with Austria, Russia, and Sweden. Unfortunately, this coalition met a similar fate as its predecessors, collapsing in 1805 due to various military setbacks. The mounting challenges in Europe took a toll on Pitt's health, ultimately resulting in his death in 1806. This event reopened discussions about the leadership of the government. Grenville ascended to the role of Prime Minister, forming a Ministry of All the Talents that included Fox. Grenville's government successfully passed the Slave Trade Act of 1807, a significant achievement that gained substantial support in Parliament. After Fox's passing in September 1806, the relationship between George and the ministry soured. To bolster recruitment for the military, the ministry proposed a measure allowing Roman Catholics to serve in all ranks of the armed forces. However, George strongly opposed this proposal, directing his ministers to drop the measure and not to propose it again in the future. While the ministers agreed to abandon the current measure, they refused to commit to a future prohibition. As a result, the ministers were dismissed, and George appointed the Duke of Portland as nominal prime minister, while real power rested with Spencer Perceval, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Following the dissolution of Parliament, subsequent elections favored the new ministry, granting them a solid majority in the House of Commons. During this time, George III refrained from making any significant political decisions, and the transition from Portland to Perceval in 1809 proved largely inconsequential to the ongoing political landscape. In conclusion, the latter part of George III's reign was characterized by political strife, societal upheaval, and personal health challenges. His popularity fluctuated due to various events, including his compassionate treatment of individuals with mental health issues and the tumultuous backdrop of the French Revolutionary Wars. Throughout this period, the monarchy navigated complex political dynamics, balancing the demands of public opinion, the realities of war, and the king's own convictions regarding religion and governance. In late 1810, King George III was at a peak of popularity, but he faced many personal challenges. He was nearly blind due to cataracts, suffered from painful rheumatism, and his mental health took a serious turn for the worse. The stress from the death of his youngest and favorite daughter, Princess Amelia, contributed to his mental decline. The princess's nurse described the daily scenes of sorrow and crying surrounding her passing as incredibly sad and distressing. Recognizing his deteriorating condition, George agreed to the need for the Regency Act of 1811, which allowed his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, to take on the role of regent. This change meant the prince would manage the affairs of the kingdom for the remainder of George's life. Although there were signs of recovery in May 1811, by the end of that year, George III had succumbed to permanent insanity. He spent his final years in seclusion at Windsor Castle, away from the public eye. During this time, significant political changes occurred. In 1812, Prime Minister Spencer Perceval was assassinated, and Lord Liverpool took his place. Liverpool led the country through the later stages of the Napoleonic Wars, which ended with British victory. Following the war, the Congress of Vienna took place, resulting in notable territorial gains for Hanover, which was upgraded from an electorate to a kingdom. As George's health continued to decline, he developed dementia. By this point, he was completely blind and increasingly deaf. He could not comprehend that he had been declared King of Hanover in 1814, nor could he grasp the reality of his wife's death in 1818. The situation worsened, and during Christmas in 1819, he spoke nonsensically for an astonishing 58 hours. In the final weeks of his life, he lost the ability to walk. George III passed away from pneumonia at Windsor Castle at 8:38 p.m. on January 29, 1820. His death came just 6 days after the passing of his fourth son, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strafford. At his side was his favorite son, Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany. Following his death, George lay in state for 2 days, and his funeral was held on February 16 at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. King George III's later years were marked by personal tragedy and health struggles, along with significant political events in Britain. His reign ended quietly, reflecting the tumultuous changes both within his life and the country. Throughout King George III's reign, a strong movement against slavery grew in Britain, fueled by both abolitionists and revolts among enslaved people in the Atlantic. Historian Andrew Roberts notes that George III never owned or sold a slave, nor did he invest in any businesses involved in slavery. In fact, he supported legislation aimed at abolishing slavery. In the 1750s, George wrote a document that condemned the arguments in favor of slavery, calling them shameful and absurd. However, both he and his son, the Duke of Clarence, also backed the London Society of West India Planters and Merchants in their efforts to delay the abolition of the British slave trade for nearly 20 years. William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister at the time, wanted to see slavery end. However, due to divisions in the cabinet and the king's pro-slavery stance, Pitt chose not to push for abolition as an official government policy. Instead, he worked toward ending slavery on a personal level. On November 7, 1775, during the American War of Independence, John Murray, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation that promised freedom to enslaved individuals if they fought for the British against the American rebels. Dunmore was the last royal governor of Virginia, having been appointed by King George III in July 1771. His proclamation encouraged many enslaved people to escape and join the British forces. Later, on June 30, 1779, George III's commanding general, Henry Clinton, expanded upon Dunmore's proclamation with the Philipsburg Proclamation. This decree stated that any colonial slave who fled their rebel master would not be captured or sold again and would be protected by the British military. As a result, around 20,000 freed slaves fought for the British during the war. In 1783, about 3,000 of these former slaves, along with their families, settled in Nova Scotia after receiving British certificates of freedom. Between 1791 and 1800, nearly 400,000 Africans were forcibly taken to the Americas through 1,340 slave voyages that started from British ports, such as Liverpool and Bristol. On March 25, 1807, George III signed an act for the abolition of the slave trade, making it illegal to engage in the transatlantic slave trade across the British Empire. After George III's death, the throne passed to two of his sons, George IV and William IV. Both of them ruled in turn, but neither had surviving legitimate children, so the crown eventually went to Victoria, the only legitimate child of George's fourth son, Prince Edward. George III lived for 81 years and 239 days, with a reign that lasted 59 years and 96 days. His life and reign were longer than any previous king and those who followed, except for Queens Victoria and Elizabeth II. George III earned the nickname Farmer George from satirists, initially meant to mock his interest in everyday matters rather than focusing entirely on politics. However, over time, this name came to represent his modest lifestyle, in contrast to the more extravagant behavior of his son. During George's reign, the British agricultural revolution reached its height, bringing great improvements in farming, science, and industry. This period saw massive growth in the rural population, which provided much of the labor for the Industrial Revolution. George had a strong interest in science and mathematics. His collection of scientific instruments is now owned by King's College London and has been on display at the Science Museum in London since 1927. George had the King's Observatory built in Richmond-upon-Thames to observe the 1769 transit of Venus. He also supported William Herschel, the astronomer who discovered Uranus in 1781. Herschel initially wanted to name the planet after George, calling it George's star, and the king funded the construction of a huge telescope for him, which was the largest ever built at that time. George III once expressed hope that people wouldn't twist his intentions or exaggerate his achievements, but public opinion has varied. While he was very popular at the start of his reign, the American Revolutionary War caused him to lose the support of many colonists, though a significant number remained loyal to him. The Declaration of Independence painted George as a tyrant responsible for repeated injuries against the colonies, and this language has strongly influenced how he is remembered in American history. Accounts of George III's life fall into two categories. Some portray him as a symbol of national resistance against French influence, while others, particularly from the early part of his reign, are more critical and reflect the political strife of the time. Historians in the 19th and early 20th centuries often took a negative view of George's life. However, in the mid-20th century, historian Louis Namier argued that George had been unfairly criticized, and this led to a reassessment of his legacy. Later scholars, like Butterfield and Pears, as well as McAlpine and Hunter, have taken a more sympathetic approach, viewing George as someone who faced difficult circumstances and illness. Butterfield, in particular, criticized earlier historians for misinterpreting George's life. He believed that some of them, like Erskine May, created complex and misleading narratives that strayed far from the truth. When George III fought against the American colonists, he believed he was defending the right of Parliament to impose taxes, not trying to increase his own power. Modern scholars agree that during his long reign, the monarchy lost much of its political influence, while George himself became a symbol of national values and ethics. Thank you for watching. If this story sparked your interest or made you think, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you don't want to miss more fascinating stories, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more to share, and trust me, the next one is going to surprise you. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.